My favorite analogy of the plate is like my plate is so full right now because I'm able to. I don't have the kids. They don't have anything else. I don't have a mortgage. But constantly I feel the things falling off that aren't nutritious. Like I'll be like, oh, there went like the ketchup or the pasta sauce or the salad dressing. I still have all the nutrients on my plate. I'm moving forward, but I lost all the flavor at times. And so it's like trying to figure out how to like keep everything from falling off the plate is a constant juggling act. And it does mean that you have to ask for help and look around you sometimes, because it's otherwise you will eventually find yourself in a hole that you've dug yourself out of, your incredible work ethic. But that doesn't mean that that's valuable at that time anymore. Being good at digging when you're in a hole is not a valuable skill.
That's Alexey Vermeulen, former professional World Tour road racer turned professional gravel racer, describing how he thinks about balancing the very full plate that constitutes his career. Racing at the highest level in gravel, arguably the most popular and fastest growing discipline in North America, while creating marketing value for his sponsors through projects that also give back to the sport. Hear how he prioritizes focus to keep both feet on the ground, metaphorically speaking, even while he pursues what he half-jokingly calls delusional goals. His surprisingly straightforward approach is a nod to the value of analog tools and never losing sight of what is truly important. You're listening to the Be a Good Wheel podcast, the show where we explore what it means to be a good wheel by digging into scientific research and personal stories about human potential and performance. I'm your host, Amber Pierce. From the road to gravel, Alexey Vermeulen has proven his adaptability, work ethic, and resilience, not only on the bike, but also as an entrepreneur, marketing professional, and thought leader in the sport. Alexey's talent was evident early on when he became a junior national champion. His professional career took off in 2014 with the BMC development team, where he quickly gained recognition with a podium finish in the Under-23 National Championship time trial. In 2016, Alexey made the leap every aspiring pro dreams of, signing with the World Tour team Lotto Jumbo at just 20 years old. Competing at the World Tour level, he raced alongside cycling's biggest names. Notable performances included a fourth place in the Young Riders Jersey competition at the 2016 Amgen Tour of California, and a fifth place on a stage of the 2017 Criterium du Dauphiné. He continued to impress with podium finishes in the U.S. National Championships. Despite his road racing success, Alexey began to feel stagnant and drawn to a new challenge. When his team didn't renew his contract, he joined a Continental team before pivoting to a mix of mostly mountain biking and gravel racing as an independent athlete, supported by personal sponsors, a role known in cycling as a privateer. Initially focusing on cross-country mountain biking, Alexey's breakthrough came in 2019 at the Iceman Cometh mountain bike race in Michigan, where he triumphed over some iconic names in the sport. He didn't stop there. As gravel racing surged in popularity, he became a prominent figure in the off-road scene, securing major results. These included a win at the 2022 Belgian Waffle Ride in Utah, with consistent podium finishes at the event since 2020. His results at marquee gravel events known for challenging terrain and fierce competition, along with major mountain bike wins, have solidified Alexey's reputation as a top gravel cyclist and off-road all-arounder. Alexey's transparency and passion for the sport have endeared him to fans and fellow riders alike. He's a regular presence on social media, often featuring his sidekick, Sir Willie the Wiener Dog, who enjoys rides from a backpack as Alexey pedals. Alexey has channeled his love for cycling and marketing savvy into projects that support the broader cycling community. One such initiative is From the Ground Up, a project where Alexey and fellow racer Ryan Petrie equip, train, and mentor novice cyclists to tackle the Leadville 100, one of the toughest bike races in the world. Now in its fourth season, this project aims to shorten learning curve in cycling for riders new to the sport and chronicles the athletes' experiences on YouTube. This year, Alexey launched Phase 2, a new project giving 2 young racers the opportunity to compete in 3 Lifetime Grand Prix events with pro-level equipment, mechanic support, and mentorship. The Lifetime Grand Prix is the premier off-road racing series in North America, featuring an invite-only start list and substantial media coverage. With Phase 2, Alexey aims to create a sustainable pathway from high school leagues to potential professional cycling careers for aspiring young gravel racers. More information and links to both projects are in the show notes. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Welcome to the show, Alexey. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Amber. It's funny to be here and not on Mount Lemon.
I know. It's been a minute. um,
I think 2013 was the last
I
time we saw
know.
each other in person.
I know. We had a phenomenal conversation, literally all the way up Mount Lemon. It was so good.
Yeah.
And it's been so fun to watch everything that you've been doing since. And I'm really excited to get into all of that. You've got some very cool, just exciting projects that are doing things in a really different way. And we'll get to those. But given your breadth of experience in the sport, I'm really curious to know, is there something that you believe to be true about success or achievement that turned out to be a myth in your experience?
This might be an unpopular vote, but I was actually talking to my girlfriend about this yesterday.
Ooh.
I think the belief that you always have to have fun can be a myth.
Oh, that's interesting.
As you grow up, I think there's a point where that's true. When you're 12 and 14 and 15, that's true. You should be having fun majority of the time. As it becomes something that is your job, or you are expected to do things on a daily basis, whether it's a certain amount of training or going to the gym, I would argue that there's days that aren't fun. And by saying that it's all supposed to be fun sets this idea up in people's minds that hard work is always going to be fun. And I think that's just something I've learned as I've gone through, is like, it's not a bad thing that you struggle through a day. I still love what I do over the course of it. But if I have a given week, I'll probably have a day where I'm like, this freaking sucks right now. And I have to motivate myself by picking a new ride, or like going to a coffee shop or something else. And it's not that it's everyone has that, whether it's going to the office or going on a bike ride, but it's not always the thing you want to do at that moment.
Right. And that idea that it needs to be fun all the time maybe sets up an unrealistic expectation. I am so glad that you said this, because I'm always pushing for integrating fun. And I think a lot of, we'll say, people who are really excited about racing, but they maybe haven't raced professionally, like they've raced at a high level as an amateur, or they're getting into it, have this idea that as pros, the professional racers are just somehow like robotic superhuman that can like grind it out and just be super hardcore day in and day out. And so I like to push against that narrative by saying, no, actually, even as a professional and professionals are hardcore, but even as professionals can also have fun. So I'm constantly kind of pushing against that kind of, just harden up and that's the solution to everything. But you're so right that the opposite is true. Because if you set up that expectation that everything has to be fun when it's not fun, if that's your expectation, you start wondering, well, am I doing something wrong? Like, it introduces this other form of doubt.
Yeah, it's a little bit like waking up in the morning and walking outside, and you have a 5-hour training day and it's pissing rain, and you want to convince yourself it's exciting. So you sit, this is so great. You can say whatever you want. That's not a great day to go ride a bike outside. I get it. It might work for a month or 2 months or 4 months, but like eventually you realize that maybe I should change to my recovery day for today and then do my ride tomorrow when it's sunny. I think it's just a constant, we can go way down this, but like the reality is it's always more mental than it is physical. And so I think when you start to convince yourself that everything should be better than it is, when it really does get tough in a race, or when you get sick or injured when you're preparing for something, you go into mental shutdown because there's nothing else left. You've already used all your positivity on normal, mundane training or everyday life.
Oh my gosh, yes. And okay, so I really want to riff on this for a little bit, because I think this is so important. On one hand, if you're taking the harden up approach, you can use up force of will, right? It's raining outside. This sucks. I'm just going to be super hardcore and go and do this thing. And you do that day in and day out. You're going to use up that force of will. So by the time those moments show up in the race, you're going to be empty. On the other hand, what you're saying is, if you're using up your positivity and convincing yourself that this is really fun, you are going to be empty on that front. So these are like two different tools that we have at our disposal, right? To handle these moments that are really difficult. How do you find the balance in that? Because that is true. This is a balance. It's not one or the other, right?
It's funny because I was just going to say, so you have to throw all that in and then toss in some balance. Because the reality is,
Yes.
you also do have to go train in the rain sometimes. You do have to do these
Yes.
things. And I think that is what it is to be a true professional. And anything, I would use the word professional very generally, of like professional of accounting, professional of bike riding,
Yes.
is understanding balance and common sense of, okay, what is the value of this going forward? And the value is very hard to see typically, because in life, a lot of things that I do this week don't affect next week. They affect 3 weeks or 4 weeks from now.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times I'm looking at things based on like, how am I feeling mentally and what does it take to get this workout done? And what have I done in the past? And I think if you're always looking forward, so like I'll use this very much in my perspective as a professional cyclist. If I look at a week, I'm talking to my coach, who I've worked with since I was 14 years old. So it's very easy to have these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I can look and say, okay, this week looks great. Throw in whatever you want. And then in the middle of the week, if I'm like, hey, I'm really struggling, I have a decision of like, okay, am I struggling enough to tell him, or am I just going to figure it out my own way? Am I going to go ride with a friend? Am I going to change something up? Am I going to do a lap and pick up my dog? All these different things that could motivate me to enjoy the ride and get it done. And then from there, I think is a pivot point of like, did that change the trajectory of the week or the goals of the week? Because to me, I look at it and like each week is a new page. Because if I can do like, if I look too far ahead, it gets too stressful. And if you look too short, you don't see the runway in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's a lot of people struggle with balance because they look just at one day, or they're not able to compartmentalize a day. Something goes bad, training goes poorly, or someone yells at you at the office, and you take that in, and there's nothing else to do other than stare at that one horrible thing that happened that didn't feel good. And you can't look at the other 6 days of the week that went well.
Right. Yeah, it's looking at the whole picture. And I'm so glad that you use the word compartmentalize, because that's something that has come up on the podcast before. And it's something that it was one of those tools that when I started racing, I really over relied on, thinking that this was how you do it. You just compartmentalize. And I do my training, I get it done, and the rest of my life is not going to affect my training because I'm compartmentalizing, and that's what you're supposed to do as an athlete. And again, it's a tool, right? Because there are moments where you have to use it. But when you're using that tool all the time, you start to lose out on that bigger picture. Like you said, like I'll give an example from my career. I remember there was one year, there was just a lot of personal upheaval in my life, really heavy emotional stress. And I was just tuning it out to go do my training rides. And then I would get done with these training rides and I'd email my coach and I'd be like, I'm so destroyed. And my coach was this brilliantly motivating person. And he would just like give me these amazing pep talks. And I would get fired up and I'd go out again the next day. But what happened was this happened month over month over month over month. And when I finally burned out, we went back and looked at these email threads, and it was like, oh, there were 3 or 4 months of me reaching out almost on a daily basis saying, I'm so tired, and him thinking it was a motivation issue, not, and so looking for those bigger patterns and not just focusing on the smaller things. What have you learned about using compartmentalization specifically as a tool in your arsenal?
It's funny that you mentioned compartmentalization in your career, because for me, compartmentalization is one of the reasons I think I'm professional. I would argue it over like a lot of my peers. But I think I'm exactly what you just said is like, I use compartmentalization a little differently. I think of compartmentalization as problem solving a lot of times, of like, I have this problem to solve. I'm either putting this as the priority of my life right now, or it's secondary, or it's third on the list, or it's fourth. And then for me, I come back to that list when I have time based on what the priority is at a given time. And I think compartmentalization can be exactly how you just described it. It can be very based on just trying to move through what you know you have to do to get to a certain goal. But it can also be based on like that big picture we just talked about of like, I want to do all of these things. My plate is incredibly full, probably too full. So if I want to be successful, I have to pick what takes precedent at a given time and then come back to what else matters. And to me, it's that compartmentalization. So we're going to get into from the ground up, but I run a film project that takes beginner riders to a race. If the last 3 years, that race has been Leadville. If I worry about the fact that I'm on my legs for 12 hours a day, the 3 days leading in, or that I'm helping them and I'm up till midnight before my race, and I start thinking about my race because that's where I put the priority, then my race isn't going to go well and I'm not going to support them.
Yeah.
But I've found that if I can put all of my energy into what they need, because they're as stressed as I ever was, right? They don't know what gels they're going to take. They're still figuring out how they're going to get through 100 miles at altitude.
Yeah.
And then the minute they go to bed, I can turn my focus to me. I've found that my body and my mind doesn't waste energy on nonsense. I can wake up at 6 a.m. and guess what? My body knows what to do. I've done this 1,000 times. Yeah. And I think that compartmentalization of not throwing anything away, but okay, I have these two things going on. Both of them can't happen at once. It allows for just like, okay, that's done and move forward. And I think I see that a lot in my life just with notepads. My girlfriend hates me, but I will always have a yellow legal pad, like just random lists. She's like, this makes no sense. Why is this on the list? So this hasn't been on the list for 3 months. I'm like, yeah, just there's no priority to it. I'll get there. So I think for me, it's always trying to look at that bigger picture and be able to say, okay, this is a problem I have to solve. I'm not ignoring this. So I make sure I write down or keep it up, but I need to come back to this after this moment because right now I don't think this is as important or more important than what I'm doing currently.
Yeah. I think that's the crux, right? Is you come back to it. You don't continue to ignore it. Yep. Like, I think that was exactly what I didn't do was I was like, this emotional stress, I'll deal it, like it's there. I have to handle, like I have to deal with it on a daily basis, but I'm not going to account for it in terms of, rest and recovery or like problem solving. It was just kind of this, death of a loved one and grieving and really heavy stuff that wasn't going away. And I was kind of just doing my best to ignore it instead of setting it down and then coming back and picking it up again. I think that's really the crux of it.
100%. I think that's the easy part, right, in life is to be like, oh, this sucks. I don't want to deal with it. Or it's just confrontation. And I think this is scary. And you just leave it there because if you don't talk about it, it might be better, right? But then at some point, I feel like those things boil up or there's one of the things out of 5 that need to be dealt with in a timely manner. And then it just gets worse.
Yeah. And I was going to ask, and I'm so glad you lifted up your notebook because I was going to ask this process of triage that you use, like, what is your system for it? And it's a simple yellow notepad. I love it.
Yeah. I like writing it down and crossing it off. I think that's like a type A thing where I need the X over it. Somehow just the iPhone list with the check marks doesn't do it for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I feel like every time I'm on the plane, I'm like, okay, what haven't I thought of? What do I have to do? Where does it exist on this list? So I have like also lists based on like geography, like, oh wow, like this is my garage list. This is my house list, but also just generic lists. So and and sometimes my girlfriend will come in and be like, TV time, because she knows I'll look at my list and cross it off.
What's on the TV time list? I love it. Oh, that's great. I mean, it's such a, in this day and age, there are so many different productivity tools and, ultimately, and I really appreciate this because I find a lot of anxiety relief in kind of outsourcing the things in my brain to a piece of paper or anything that's external, right? Like that I'm not having to just remember it in my head helps so much. And there is something also to just physically writing it out, right? Like it's a little bit slower. It's almost like you're intentionally introducing a little bit of friction to the process. Is that true? Does that resonate with you?
Yes. I think also for me, I also write things out. I have like this notebook of like places I've been, favorite restaurants that I had there, like very generic things. It's a book of like sponsor phone calls all the way to like, I went to a brother's bachelor party and like wrote down all my favorite parts about New Orleans, like just a random book of information for me. And so I think a lot of it for me also with lists and writing things down is that it feels more real. Like I've had this yearning to go back a little bit to like disposable cameras recently. Like my girlfriend made fun of me because I bought photo albums because that's what I remember growing up. And I go to look for something in iCloud and I can't freaking find it.
Yeah.
And I think I want, as this person that wants to feel things, is that I want to be able to go to my book and search through every page and find what I'm looking for, as opposed to saying, I know I have this list somewhere. It's on Google Drive somewhere.
Which of the
I hate
clouds?
that feeling. I hate trying to find something. The only app I've ever found that is like somewhat decent is Training Peaks, and that's because we have something in life to tie it to, right? Where like you
Mhm.
can write notes in Training Peaks and you remember that race or that crash. So you might be a year off for a given moment, but you'll find it pretty quick because
Right.
it's so chronological that
Yeah.
there's nothing else going on. You just did training.
Mhm.
It's the only place I've ever found where like I for a while like was writing in Training Peaks and on a notepad, and I was like, "This is stupid. I'm never going to use the notepad ever again. My writing's squiggly, and I can't read it, and I'm like, I don't want to be writing this."
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, I feel you on that. That's huge. I want to touch back also on something that you said about Leadville and focusing on the races of the folks that you're helping versus focusing on your own race. To me, what came up when you were describing that was the difference between the things that are within your control and the things that are not. And I remember when I used to get nervous for a race, part of what made me nervous about it was up until the start line, I couldn't do anything about it, right? Like I could prepare the best I could prepare. But once I've prepared, like, thinking about it and trying to anticipate everything that could possibly happen in the race, it's not, I can't actually do anything until the race starts and I can actually respond to what is happening in reality in the moment. And I love that when you focus on the other people's races, helping them is something that is in your power to control at that moment versus worrying about your own race, which hasn't happened yet and is therefore not exactly in your control. Is that resonating with you at all?
yeah, it's pretty spot on. I mean, I think the biggest thing I don't like the word distraction, but it does fit
Mm-hmm.
best, right? Because it's
Mm-hmm.
not a distraction. It's something I chose to do. It's something I like. The same as picking goals at the beginning of the season. In November, I'm
Yeah.
planning this project the same as I'm planning my race season. So I think it's one of those things that is very much I want it to be habitual, but the
Mm-hmm.
reality is that the little thing in your mind that you just talked about that is like being okay in that time where there's nothing else to do and
Yeah.
being okay with the uncontrollables that are not you can't deal with is something that isn't I think is very learned. It's very
Mm-hmm.
hard to for people to just be like you can't tell someone like, oh, don't worry about it. Like they're just gonna get angry at you, right? You can find that in romantic
Super
relationships and
helpful.
also on the bike.
Right.
Yeah. But at some point, like I believe a lot of that to be true, right? Moving from the road to gravel and mountain biking, road cycling obviously has this romantic, like a flat or a crash is something you encounter and can usually move forward.
Right.
Gravel mountain biking, you're alone. You can encounter it, take it on
Yeah.
however you want, but now you're on the side of the road, stressed by yourself, and you have to ride 100 and something miles back by yourself, probably. There's no cars, there's no one to help you fix a flat if your tire's cut. And so I think a lot of it, you have to be okay going into for what I do now, I have to be okay with
Mm-hmm.
it. Every race just might not go my way.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a really tough thing to get over. And I don't think I could do it every weekend, week out. That's why I'm like, everyone's like, oh, you don't race as much as you did. Like, I think now I'll race maximum 20 days where I used to race 60 to 65 to 70. And I'm like, yeah, but those 7 weekends take it all out of me because you
Yeah.
prepare everything you can for the uncontrollables and then they happen
Mm-hmm.
and you still ride to the finish line and you're like, why did I do that?
I'm curious about this because it sounds like what you're saying is your ability to live in, tolerate, embrace the uncertainty, right, around what may or may not happen in a race is a learned skill, not something that you either just naturally handle well or not. Is it a skill that you've learned? And how do you think that you've managed to cultivate that, if it is?
See, and this is where I think it gets tied all back together. Like to me, that is a level of compartmentalization. It's a
Mm-hmm.
level of how do I figure out what's best for me in this moment, whether that's trickery, whether I need to go ride out in the rain and it is
Mm-hmm.
best for me right now, or whether it's I just need to be with the reality of this moment and figure this out and then I can figure out what I'm going to do next. Like
Right.
one of my favorite sayings is like, that's a future Alexi problem. Because a lot of times that's a future Alexi problem. I
Yeah.
don't have an answer for you right now. I'll figure out an answer. I'm not ignoring it. But that's going to be in another hour and another day.
Mm-hmm.
And so in those moments, I think it is a little bit of like compartmentalization generalizes it, but it's what do I need to do right now to keep moving forward? That's what we all want to do, right? We want to keep moving
Mm-hmm.
forward in life or in a race or in a bike. And then once I'm moving, I can think about what else I forgot or have to deal with now. Okay, now I'm a minute and a half behind the group I need to be in. Is the race worth it? Am I going to ride all out? Am I going to stop?
Mm-hmm.
In life, I think it's the same way. And that's for me it's been this weird feeling of learning. And we're going to get into this, I feel like coming
Yeah.
from the road, I had everything done for me.
Mm-hmm.
And when I came, I'd never had a real job. I'd finished high school, obviously, but like deferred college, moved to Europe, learned a lot. And I'll constantly say I was educated by the bike at that point, but was so naive to the fact of what you have to do in daily life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think as I've moved to gravel and there's a lot more that I do now for myself, you also learn a little bit about how you need to put compartmentalization into your life because it's not the same for everybody, right?
Right.
Right now, I can be super selfish. I don't have kids. I have a dog and a girlfriend and a rental apartment, right? If I want to leave for 2 months and leave the apartment, I can do that. There's nothing stopping me, no issues. Got to communicate with my girlfriend and figure out where the dog's going. But right, there's nothing holding me back. As you add these things into your life, compartmentalization isn't so simple. You can't just pretend like you're the only person in the middle of the world. So I think it's all of these things that we just talked about, and I think there are a lot of buzzwords that go around. But if you can find a way to use compartmentalization to just move forward in your own life, and then add in the balance that fits in, that is where I think this all fits in. Everything we've talked about, because it's just simple to say, oh, this is what matters, but you can't say it until you're in that moment. I can't just say this race matters because I don't know what's going to happen in that race. I have to deal with the problems that are going to happen there. And I think it's very easy for people to be like, I'm ready. I know what's going to happen. You don't. You can pretend, but you don't.
That's so true. I kind of think this is all in a way, like one way of looking at this is the judicious use of and directing of focus, right? So you used the word distraction earlier and mentioned that you don't like that word, but it's also just a way of redirecting your focus, right? Like I'm going to focus on the people that I've been mentoring, and then I'm going to focus on my race and being really judicious and intentional about when and where you are turning that focus. And similarly in the race, like between races, you can focus on your prep, you can focus on, a session to triage the problems on your yellow notepad. But in the race, one of the things that's, about racing is you have to focus on what comes up. So you don't necessarily get to choose what problems you're going to solve, but you have to intentionally direct your focus on the fly based on what is coming up for you in the race.
Yeah. I mean, I think to me, it's bringing it all back to like prioritization of like, once you're in the race, that's all that's happening to me. Right. Like, and even I think, you can take that to a step of like, say you have kids and a real job and things to do. If you've done the work to be at Leadville, that's the beauty of the race. Once you're there racing, you can forget about the stress of everything else in that 6 to 10, 12 hours, right? Because that's what you're focused on. You gave yourself this time, you built in this time into your life. Your wife and kids are either there or they're not, or your husband and kids are there or they're not. And you can choose to use them as motivation. But the reality is, if you just want to be in this blissful air of nothingness, that's the beauty of racing, right? And so I think it's trying to find that in daily life too, where you set goals or parameters around like, this is what I've been working toward. And now how do I just to focus and be so present with this thing? I think bike riding or sport makes it really easy because run marathons, one foot in front of the other, right? Cycling, it's, okay, this mountain's coming. Now I descend this mountain. And I think if we find those things, it's easy to create this pattern and rhythm that brings things back, right? And it takes it into, why am I having this distraction? Or why am I choosing to do this as opposed to this? And then you can figure out where that fits in the cycle. Because I don't know, I think everything is a cycle. You just got to look far enough away.
Fully. I agree completely. I think this is so powerful and it's going to be so useful for people too. You mentioned the difference between racing gravel and gravel being long distance races that are off-road, but they're not mountain biking, right? They're not I mean, they can be trails. It's just generally off-road on a gravel bike, which looks like a road bike with drop bars typically, but bigger tires. And then contrast that with the road where you are racing in a team that is typically supported by a staff, especially where you were racing on the world tour. You've got staff, you have vehicle support, you have cars following the race, and even staff beyond the staff of your team staff. You have race staff, you've got medical support, you've got there's so much more infrastructure there to support the athletes. And you mentioned that this was a difficult learning all of what we were just discussing about directing your attention and handling all of this more on your own versus having some of it maybe triaged or prioritized for you. Did most of this learning happen when you transitioned to gravel, or was this something that you were starting to learn when you were racing on the road?
As I was debating on whether I was going to try to stay in the road really or move on, I felt like that was where learning started. I felt like I knew I was missing things. I had stopped learning, and I was constantly in this place of just like existing. And to me, that wasn't fun. I love learning. When I don't understand something, I want to figure it out. I'm the person that's probably going to pick my phone up under the table and Google something at dinner because I want to understand why or figure out.
I can relate to that.
Even worse, being the eldest child, where I want to prove that I was right about something. So I think that was the impetus once I realized that like maybe road didn't fit best into what I wanted. Was like, okay, what am I gaining? What am I losing? And that's what I was gaining. That's what outweighed a lot of like, because I still miss the road racing a lot. Like I watch a lot of my old peers and colleagues race, and I miss that ability to get the most out of yourself as an athlete. That doesn't really exist in gravel, in my opinion, because of the problems you don't know if you're going to encounter. I could really go into like 8 out of 10 races and they could all go to shit just based on bad luck.
100%.
And that's really hard to figure out in your head. I think the other thing that I learned moving from the road to gravel is that it's just a lot more young. It's a lot newer. And so gravel was figuring itself out, and that was exciting. But I, comparatively to what you're talking about with staff, all these people supporting you on the road.
Yeah.
Gravel, you get to create that yourself, right? I can decide of like, hey, I want to bring this friend here. Hey, I want to bring my girlfriend here. Hey, I need support here. I need photos here. And so it's stressful at first, but as you figure it out, as someone who I think like I would have been in business school or in something like that, I've really loved trying to structure it and figure out what's best for me and for the people around me that I'm working with at a given time, and understand that the racing is a portion of what I do. It's not everything. And that's the difference between gravel and road racing, in my opinion. Road racing is results first, and I think it should be.
Yeah.
Gravel right now is young enough where it's a little bit of everything, right? You're so tied to each company of like, are you providing non-public facing feedback? Are you putting a face forward that's positive for that company, right? Like, I feel like everyone has their identity now. It's like, I'm the dog guy. There's a mustache guy. Everyone has a place, right? And then beyond that, are you getting results? And so if you tie all these things together and you do it well, I can hit every part of like who I want to be, right? I get to pitch all these companies. I get to do my accounting and work with somebody. I get to do the logistics for my race. And it can be stressful for people, but for me, it's exciting. I like to plan all those things out. So it's been a big learning curve, but it's also like something that I felt like I needed in life, because I was at the time 23 years old and I was like, what do I do next? I have no college degree. I'm living in Europe. And now I'm 29 and I like could have never guessed that I'd be where I am and be as happy to know that there's a platform post-career now that I can go to. And on the road, that felt very far away.
Yeah. So when you say you felt like the road made more of an opportunity to see your full potential as an athlete, is that because there was so much support, so you didn't you didn't have to expend energy on all of that support stuff, and the racing was more predictable. If something went wrong, it didn't mean the end of your race. It was more like those things are kind of blips on the radar versus a full determinant of the outcome of an entire race.
Yeah, the racing for sure, like we talked about, I think comes in a little bit, but more what you started with. I think a lot of it had to do with everything is set up for you. It's so simple to put all of your energy into racing. Like right now for gravel, I book a flight. I decide who's coming with me on that flight. I rent a car. I figure out the hotel we're going to. We drive to the hotel. I'm probably driving. I get there. I build my own bike that I traveled with. I deal with the problems that TSA or the airline ruined. And then I get to focus on like going and pre-riding.
Right.
Juxtapose that with what I grew up in. And I was very lucky to have a lot of big teams support me from BMC on. But someone else will book the flight for you. All you say is what airport you want to fly out of in your aisle or window preference. Someone books the flight for you. You show up at the airport. They pick you up. They already have your bike built. You show up at the hotel. You can go take a nap and have a massage if you'd like. Then you go ride. Dinner's planned. Like the amount of times I've ended up at like 7-Eleven finding breakfast the next day because I'm waking up at 3:30 to race. I cannot. I'm like, and that is only on you. You didn't plan well enough.
Right.
But it hurts. You're like, okay, I'm eating French toast sticks today. And there's no other, it's very humbling. And it's real life. That's real. And that's, I think, why I love it. And you learn from it. But is a very big difference between being able to focus completely on the training and then the racing, and then having to look at all these other little dots that come up and, okay, how do I deal with that? And that's also, you can take that one step further and you can look at one race and how busy that weekend is, but also how busy the year is of like, okay, now I have to make sure that I'm keeping up with sponsors. I have to be negotiating and working with sponsors, all of those things that I think make what I do possible in terms of like finances. And so it's like, you can't just forget one of them and be like, my compartmentalization idea doesn't work that well right now. I can't just be like, oh, I'll deal with that one later. Cool. You don't get paid then. If you don't invoice, you don't get paid. So that's your own choice. So it's like, it just keeps going. And I don't know. Everything was I look back and it's funny. Everything, when I first signed with Lotto, with Jumbo in 21, everything was so simple. Like my apartment was €350. It came right out of my account. I didn't look at it. I just knew there was more money in there than was going out. I was living in Girona, right? Everything was just easy and like, hey, we're going to pick you up tomorrow at 7:30. Cool. I'll be up and have my carry-on suitcase because you have everything else.
Yeah.
So I think it's a part of growing up, but it's also like, I look at that sometimes and I don't regret the decision, but I do miss it sometimes.
What elements do you miss most?
Team camaraderie.
I hear that.
I miss finishing a race, and I even I've done road nationals every year for the last, because it's my only kind of feeling to touch that, and I miss that feeling of like you finish and everyone's celebrating together after. Gravel finishes and like you kind of like pat on the back, but that's it, because we are rivals, and even the guys that are teammates, they're teammates, but there's no value in them being teammates in the race. Right. If that makes sense. They don't work with each other really. Maybe they don't like chase each other, but they're not going to stop and give a wheel very often. They're not going to like, it's very much a team by jersey as opposed to a team by proving it, right? You're never going to see someone share a bike. You're never going to see, because there's no other bike coming. Cool. You got a bike that's 2 sizes too small. Now you're alone on a bike and you get to ride it. So it's, I think the biggest thing is that, but I also miss a little bit of the romance and flow to road racing. There's a beauty to it, I think. And after road nationals, I wrote this. I always do these kind of like race reports, but I kind of try to just explain my feelings in it as opposed to like what happened. Right. And I wrote it 3 times and I had to keep deleting it because every time I was like just harping on gravel of all the things that I think is doing wrong. And that wasn't the point of it. The point of it was just that I had all these feelings bubbling up about what I missed about the road, that you go out to road nationals, you just realize it, right? Gravel is just chaos. It might be organized at times, but it's just plain chaos. Yeah. Road has this element of flow to it that you just feel, right? It can be really tough and chaotic, but it's not that it's not this craziness that just devolves into nothingness. It's
Right.
has this element of like, you're on the same lap, you know the road, you've pre-ridden it, it's closed. I know this descent. We're taking it at 55 miles an hour, but I know this descent and I trust the person in front of me. And like, okay, there's 20 guys left. Like there's still an element of like, this is really hard and it's getting harder, which is the same as gravel. But gravel is like, oh, we just lost 3 guys to flats. Oh, we like, it's just, you're like you're more mentally tired than you are physically sometimes after a race.
Yeah.
And I had that in road racing, but it was like once a year where you're like, I had to get through this race. Oh my God, it was hailing or this or that. And like, you got to get through it. Gravel, I feel like that's almost every race. It's because you have to be so ready for the uncontrollables that there's no flow to it. No matter if you've ridden the whole course, there ain't no flow to it because you're going to hit a rock you didn't see in pre-ride.
Right. Yeah. Attrition plays such a bigger role.
Yeah, that's a good word.
Tactically in gravel than it does in road. And when you were talking about the team camaraderie, that's one thing that I really miss too. And I think it's a really misunderstood aspect about road racing. In most team sports, you have a whole team that wins, but in road, you have a whole team of people who are working together to make sure one person on the team stands on the podium. And typically you kind of have an idea of who you think that has the best chance on the day, but it really wouldn't matter. Whoever on the team could get on the podium in that jersey, that's all that matters. And I remember the first time I heard the word, the origin of the word sacrifice is, I forget the exact etymology, but the origin meaning of the word sacrifice is to make sacred. And that's one of the things I think that's so beautiful about road is everyone on the team ultimately sacrifices something truly substantial, ultimately their own shot at a result in that race in order to make sure that one of the other people on the team gets on the podium or has the best chance to get on the podium. And that element of sacrifice, when you actually do get the result, or even if you don't, the sacrifice itself makes the experience in a way feel kind of sacred. And especially when that goes back and forth, right? I don't know. Is that resonating for you?
Yeah, it did resonate with me. I think there's 2 things to it. One is that what we're viewing now, it takes me immediately back to like the Netflix series that's come out, like the Unchained with the tour. Being involved, I've really struggled watching it because having been there, right, it's all about crashing and drama. And I feel like they miss a lot of the like crazy teammate worthy moments that matter.
Yes.
There's no explanation into the drama. It's just like, hey, look, these guys crashed. Look how fast they're going. The only portion I've seen that I was like, that tells the entire story is when Tade cracked last year.
I haven't seen it. I haven't watched it. I still.
So there's a moment where
stuff like this.
Yeah. There's a moment where a leader cracks completely, right? And he rides himself and you see a teammate wait with him, a teammate that he's dropped for 16 stages. And I think the reality of it is him apologizing to his teammates at the top and then saying like, no, dude, like, no, don't apologize. It's this, I can feel it. I don't think anyone else sees it, right? But in that moment, I can have those little feelings of like, the 4 or 5 races in your career where you remember like team camaraderie is the reason the result happened.
Yes.
And I think we all have that. And that is what kept me coming back as a teammate because being the eldest first person, I always wanted to be the one who was right, the one who was leading. But there's a weird love for sacrifice, right? When you do know that it's not your day and you can make that decision on the road or in the bus the morning before and decide, this is what I'm going to do. This is our plan and execute it. And it actually works out like you planned. It's a crazy feeling. I don't think many people in their life ever have that feeling. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the only thing I can compare it to that I've seen, and I've never done this, is things like Wolf of Wall Street, like venture capitalism and finance stuff that moves so quick and just ends and has an end point where it's like, or like Margin Call, like all these movies that like are finance based that have an end point, right? Where the day ends and you have to have hit your goal and it's a team thing. You're all in there together and it's like, you're not working together, but you are. I don't know. I just like that. The only time I've ever felt it in gravel is when we went to the UCI Gravel World Championships last year. And we're all in the USA jersey. It wasn't a great version of it, but I worked really hard to explain to everybody how this can be valuable Like,
Right.
hey, we all know Keegan can actually win this. How do we each use our skills to help him? And I would say 5 out of the 11 guys actually got it.
Yeah.
But I think it's beautiful when it happens. And I think it's what makes the sport so special.
I could not agree more. And road gets a bad rap, and it gets a bad rap for some very good reasons. I'll totally acknowledge that. But this is the piece where I wish more people could give road a chance. And it kind of breaks my heart that as people kind of get into the sport early on, there aren't more opportunities to be on actual teams that are, where you can show up to even like a local or regional race, and you have not only multiple teams, but multiple teams that have enough people to actually play off against each other tactically like that. So you get that. I really like what you said about like Wolf of Wall Street and margin call, and because that's really what it's like. You're just making these split-second decisions constantly, and every decision you make affects every single other person on the team.
Yep.
And they have to respond in a split-second manner as well to whatever it is that you did. Because whatever decision I make or my teammate makes, it's going to affect what I need to do next. And it is so fast. And the only time that it's going to work out really, really well is when you never hesitate to make the decision that's going to benefit somebody else and potentially end your own race. Like, you have to be willing in that moment and never hesitate with that. And you have to be willing to risk everything at any given moment with every decision that you make. And it's wild. It's really, I so wish more people could have that experience.
Yeah. It's true. And it's also like, me growing up was one of the things that I think my dad did really well. Like, there's a lot of junior teams growing up, but they obviously didn't understand any team tactics.
Right.
And there was at the time, Bissell Pro Cycling, obviously they had a development team that was in the Midwest where I grew up. And he convinced me that was a better choice than going to try to go to hot tubes or anything like that. And at the end, for me, it really was, because I was doing these, Pro 1-2 races that I would be doing anyway, probably. But now I had a team. And even if it was locally, I had to listen to these guys who were older than me and shut my mouth. And, occasionally, one of the times they'd tell me, okay, we're going to race for you. This is how we're going to do it. And this is obviously a very low level when you're racing locally. But most of the time I had to just listen and ride how they asked, because otherwise you're just in this place where you're like, I probably shouldn't speak up right now. I'd love to tell them that, no, I'm going to ride for myself. But it's just, you have to have that learning experience of what it feels like. And I think that's everything in life, right? You have to feel it before you truly believe it, whether that's like a weight loss journey or like trying to get a different FTP threshold or anything. You have to know that what you do works. I think that's, if I try to tie all of what we've talked about together, the reason I think I found a lot of balance in my life is that I just kind of like hawked it over there until I like actually got results and was doing everything I wanted. And then I started believing in it, because I was like, holy crap, I can still be the athlete I want to be majority of the time and still have all these other things that I think are important and the reasons that I left the road. And so I think I didn't believe in it when I first started just like saying it and putting money behind it and doing things. But as it's all come to fruition year over year, I'm like, holy crap, that still worked. Oh my God, that worked again. And that's a crazy feeling, because you don't really believe it at first.
Right. And that's really interesting to me, because you had to put a lot into this for a while before, I'm guessing, before you got to the point where it really sunk in on a not just intellectual level, but a visceral level. What kept you going?
The learning aspect of it. There's a couple stories that I always tell, but like, first off, COVID or the pandemic for an athlete was a very interesting time, especially as an athlete that was transitioning. So for me, I had 1 year of racing pre-COVID in 2019, and then COVID hit. And so it really gave me a lot of space to reevaluate the way I was doing things, because it's easy to talk the talk at the beginning of the year and it's hard to walk the walk as the year progresses, right? The example of that is I can tell any given sponsor, I can tell Shimano, hey, I'm going to do all these things. I'm going to do these interactive marketing strategies. I'm going to try to get kids rides happening. And you get to the race and I'm getting my ass kicked as it is. And then I still have to go do this kids ride after. Screw that. I don't want to be here anymore. And so you realize like you can say everything you want to say, but in the moment, it's really hard to reprioritize or not let, a bad race or something affect you and affect everything. And so for me, COVID was that space to like take a deep breath, figure out like, who do I really want to work with? What do I need to make for this to be financially viable where I don't need to go back to school? Because I tried to set myself like timelines as to like, okay, you can dream, but you also have to like live with your 2 feet on the ground and not be delusional. Because I really struggle with delusion. I love setting goals. Setting goals that aren't realistic is like the bane of my existence. I could go on and on and on. That and kids with AirPods in while they're walking together. That also kills me. Maybe I'm old. Anyway, so I think that time, the pandemic for me was like, okay, sit down, figure out what you want. And that allowed me to say, okay, I can have 2 sponsors. Like I had company A and then Envy. And Envy right now is my bike sponsor. They're my wheel sponsor. They're arguably one of my biggest sponsors. There was a moment where I had to choose between a company that was going to pay me $6,000 and Envy was offering me a wheel set and 50%. And in that moment, I had to make a decision based on finances, getting to my goal of my timeline of like, I want to be able to live and pay rent and like not be stealing money from my time on the road.
Right.
Or I want to be with a company that I believe in and is US based. And I think if I were to grow would be the best for me.
Yeah.
And when you're making like 15 grand, like I did, I went back to making like 15 grand after I left the road. It's really hard to take that thing that's zero, even if you know it's right. And I think the pandemic gave me time to do that, right? It gave me time to think about my options as to what is the importance of racing. I think as a privateer, this singular person who works by themselves to set their race program up, the pandemic allowed us to think about like, all of a sudden races and events weren't the most important thing. Athletes were more important because races, we didn't know when they were going to happen or how they were going to happen.
Right.
And so that opened up this whole ability to pitch to companies. And then that's the second part of this conversation to answer your question. I started pitching a lot of companies and learning and failing a lot. And one of my most favorite stories is I was pitching a woman at Carhartt that I'm still friends with. And I got on, I had my notepad in front of me. I had my spiel. And like 10 minutes in, she goes, "Oh, honey, this is horrible." And
really?
Really. And it was obviously demoralizing and embarrassing as could be. But it was this moment of like, she really taught me what is valuable from both sides. She was able to explain, she had come from selling sponsorships at a corporate level to like NHL and NBA and MLB teams. And so she'd really taught me how it feels to actually know you're going to positively impact a company before you even start, right? Because that's the reality. We're playing in this unquantifiable space. This isn't ad marketing in a magazine. This is personal, and the ROI is not always guaranteed. And sometimes it's just a feeling, right? And so that moment was another thing to me that like began to create the person I am and start to figure out why I believed the tiny bit I did that something I'm doing or the priority I'm making is worth it, because I believed in the ideas of it. And I knew that like, if I found a place where I truly was being valuable to companies, then I could believe in my own confidence to go race because I could move that part off the track. And so I think I just kept taking that further and further and further. And when I believed in things, just kind of diving head first and dealing with the consequences after.
That's awesome. There's so much to unpack here. I just want to share briefly. I love it. Yeah. It's so good. It's so good. I had a similar experience where when I first moved to Connecticut, I'd been racing in Europe, moved to Connecticut, and I was riding around and I rode past a building and I was like, wait a minute, that name looks familiar. It turns out this company had sponsored a men's pro team, domestic pro team back in the day. And I thought, oh, they're into cycling. Like I cold called the CEO, pitched him on, just sponsoring me personally to supplement my package. And he was just like, I'm just going to tell you right now, I'm not going to sponsor you. And I was like, interesting. Would you be willing to meet with me for an hour to talk about why you won't sponsor me? And he was like, yeah, I'll do that. And we did. And I wasn't doubling down on asking for sponsorship, but we talked for 60 minutes and it was the most useful 60 minutes in developing my ability to pitch sponsorships, because learning what doesn't work was incredible. So I really I can really relate to that one. I also just want to point out something that I'm observing in your story here, which is your love of learning and transitioning over to gravel and doing all of these different things, right, that you didn't have to do when you were racing on the world tour. All of these things that you've done have been moments where you get to exercise that muscle that we first talked about, which was intentionally directing and adjusting the intensity of your focus, right? So all of these things that you took on your plate when you left the world tour used to be handled for you. Now you're handling it, pitching sponsors, managing logistics, handling your equipment, building these relationships. Every single task, even on your yellow notepad, these are moments where you're exercising that muscle and that skill. And it's no surprise to me then that you've become so skilled at that particular form of compartmentalization.
Yeah. And I think it's about figuring out when you have to let things go a little bit too, if that makes sense. Like for example, like during the pandemic, I also decided that like I'm going to learn how to work on my bike. Like, I've always said, like when you're going up on the road, you have no real reason to. But I was like, I'm going to know everything inside and out so that when it happens in the race, I can MacGyver that and I can figure it out.
I love that reference.
I broke a lot of stuff, like a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But now I build almost every one of my bikes. There came a point, 2022, I finished fourth at Leadville. I was up till like 1 a.m. working on my bike, getting stuff ready, like finalizing stuff.
Wow.
Envy, to their credit, came to me and they were like, yeah, we really think you should we'll bring a mechanic. Like, when do you let things go? When do you decide like it's okay?
Mm-hmm.
Let it go. And so I think that's one of the biggest learning experiences for me too, is that I do want to, like you talking about doing logistics for your family, and like I do want to be in control of everything. I want to be in the middle seat when we're driving. I want to watch. I want to tell everyone where they need to be. But you have to have the being successful means learning when to let go and delegate as to what's valuable to you and what's not. And so in that situation, I could have been in bed an hour and a half earlier, an hour earlier. It was still the right thing to do. And my bike needed to be 100% ready to race, and it wasn't before that.
Right.
And I had compartmentalized, and I don't think it really struggled. I would argue it didn't. Like, I sleep very well. So like, cool. I got 6 hours of sleep that night as opposed to 8. Mm-hmm. But it's this constant process of like, there is someone else who can do that. It's cool that I know how to do that. I love that I learned it. Maybe the races aren't the best time to do that anymore. And so it's trying to figure out, again, this word balance comes up of like, my favorite analogy of the plate is like my plate is so full right now because I'm able to. I don't have the kids. They don't have anything else. I don't have a mortgage. Mm-hmm. But constantly I feel the things falling off that aren't nutritious. Like, I'll be like, oh, there went like the ketchup or the pasta sauce or the salad dressing. I still have all the nutrients on my plate. I'm moving forward, but I lost all the flavor at times. And so it's like trying to figure out how to like keep everything from falling off the plate is a constant juggling act. And it does mean that you have to ask for help and look around you sometimes, because it's otherwise you will eventually find yourself in a hole that you've dug yourself out of, your incredible work ethic. But that doesn't mean that that's valuable at that time anymore. Being good at digging when you're in a hole is not a valuable skill.
That's so good and so true. Oh my gosh. So I want to again, going back and unpacking a lot of what we were talking about, the pandemic. One of the things that really struck me about racing road was, especially on the women's side, all of our contracts were 1 year. That was it. And so every single year you're renegotiating your contract, which was a super valuable skill to learn. And I don't think that I would have learned that skill had I not been forced to do it over and over, because it's really not comfortable until it gets really comfortable. And I always felt this really intense sense of urgency. Like, I was constantly terrified of losing the momentum that would get the next contract. And because of that, I think I have very few regrets about my career, but one of my regrets is that I didn't take more time to be reflective and intentional about what I wanted. And
Mhm.
I'm really curious, was that something that you had tried to do before the pandemic, or was it not until the pandemic kind of shut things down for you that you felt like you had the time and the space to do that?
I feel like I've always been good at it. I
Mm-hmm.
think I give myself a pass a couple times because like my time on the road at the top of my career on the road, like I was 21 years old, 22 years old.
Right. Oh gosh.
Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
easy for me to look back. Like, yes, I was a little rash at times. I made mistakes. I was judgmental, but like that's never going to change. No matter like if I look at it in reflection of like how I'm going to teach my kids, nothing's going to change because like
Mm-hmm.
the reality, in my opinion, between like 16 and 24, you
Oh
just
my
got to do it
gosh.
yourself. Like you have to make mistakes. You have to figure it out. A parent could help be those guidelines and boundaries you bounce off of. But like if my parents had been like, oh, he's living in Europe, we're going to go visit him every month, that would have been worse, right? I wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
have learned anything. Would have constantly relied on waiting for them to get there to help me.
Mm-hmm.
And those kind of moments of self-teaching and self-learning of like, oh, okay, maybe that wasn't the right choice last week or last month. And this is why I'm feeling that. Or like, I didn't go grocery shopping and now I'm here alone with groceries, without groceries, and I have nothing to eat. Okay, that's something you have to deal with because your parents aren't there. They don't have stuff in the freezer for you.
Yeah.
You're alone. You made this choice. And so, yes, I think there's things I can look back on and be like, I could have done that better or made this. And I think a lot of that has to do with like the ways I looked at my contract on Yumbo. Like I thought I was undefeatable. Like I thought for sure I'd get a second contract. And that's what made me, and I'm, like I said, I don't regret it because it made me think about moving this decision.
Mm-hmm.
But the
Yeah.
minute that I didn't think that the minute there wasn't a possibility to stay with Yumbo, which I was so in love with,
Mm-hmm.
and the possibility opened up of just going to another team that was less than or different in my mind, and I would be
Right.
getting paid less, I didn't love the sport anymore for that level.
Mm.
Like there became a demarcation level of like, this isn't worth that.
Yeah.
And so I think that I look back on that of like, maybe I was a little bit too high and mighty for where I sat of like, this is all going to work out. But at the same time, like that mindset of this is all going to work out is also something that's powered me. So it's
Right.
it's really hard to look back critically because
Right.
there's regrets I have, but not anything that's changed my path drastically enough to think that I'd go back and want to change it if I was able to.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. We'll hear more from Alexey after this quick break. We want to make this podcast financially sustainable and need your help to keep a good thing going. Sign up for a Be a Good Wheel membership on Ko-Fi and get access to extended guest interviews, bonus episodes, and Be a Good Wheel gear. Monthly memberships start as low as $3 per month. Go to ko-fi.com/beagoodwheel to join other members who are supporting the show. That's ko-fi.com/beagoodwheel. And now, back to our conversation with professional cyclist Alexey Vermeulen. I want to jump back into this marketing conversation because one of the things, we've talked about on the show with other athletes, and I'll just remind folks that being a professional athlete, as you've probably picked up on in this conversation, it's not just racing and training. And I'll say, I think with gravel especially, and I think this is the case with most athletes, even on the road to an extent, but not nearly to the same extent as on gravel, the results are really what make you credible as a spokesperson for a sponsor. They are not the return on investment for the sponsor. Like, especially in gravel, you're out in the middle of nowhere often. And so standing up on a box, which constitutes the podium in the middle of nowhere, and putting your hands in the air for a result isn't really going to do much for your sponsor unless you do something more to magnify that, bring value, make that meaningful. And you've done an incredible job with this.
Thanks.
And we've talked a little bit about, oh yeah, of course, your learning process with this. Two of the projects that you've come up with recently, I really love because they're focused on helping other people. And as much as you as an athlete need to be the athlete that's representing the brand, this is an interesting balance to strike. And I'm curious to hear how you think about that, because you are, as the athlete, have the results that bring that credibility for you to be able to bring value to your sponsors. And a lot of athletes will do that in a way of just talking about their own journey and their own narrative, which I'm not saying is a bad thing at all. I think it's beautiful because there's so much that can be learned in that and so much insight and relatability. And it's wonderful. But I love how much you pull others into this. So I'm curious, what kind of prompted you to do that? What need did you see in the market? How did you think about that?
Well, so the first project is called From the Ground Up, that takes very beginner athletes to a race. It's been Leadville this year at Steamboat, but setting a very lofty goal that, I guess it's funny now, but is somewhat delusional.
Yeah. Yeah.
The point of that, and that was born out of the pandemic, right? That space where all of a sudden athletes were important. I was riding with a friend who helped co-create the project. And it's this understanding and belief of kind of what you just said, that results aren't everything. And it's somewhat self-serving, but also not, in a sense that I think growing the community of people who understand cycling is valuable for everybody, especially for me who's paid out of the sport.
Yeah.
And so that's what it was. It was focused so much on trying to bring people into the sport that I love and is very daunting. It's this understanding of the pandemic brought so many people into the sport who were doing it because their gym closed or needed mental sanity from their family, not because they watched Lance on TV or went to their local crit randomly and were like, oh, what's this? Right. There was no understanding of the sport coming in. They bought a bike online most of the time, or went to the bike shop they'd passed 1,000 times because the bike shop was booming for the first time.
Yeah.
And once they got a bike, they realized all of these things that are so overwhelming, whether it's like, oh, you flatted, oh, you crashed. How do I stop correctly? How do I turn? And they learned it themselves. And a lot of times they learned it incorrectly. And then they show up to the race by themselves, expecting to have a blast. And if everything doesn't go perfectly, everything was talked about in gravel, it's a horrible experience. And they hang the bike up and they never want to do it again.
Yeah.
And so the point of it was, how do you help that? The original point was, how do you help bring that group of people in who has no idea what the sport is and educate them in a way that's valuable, right? Be able to give them information in time as opposed to throwing everything on them at once and making it overwhelming. And so it allows this belief in yourself at a certain age, or I think people have given up athletically, to say, hey, I'm going to dedicate myself in the midst of having a family and a job and everything else, and find this time management to focus for the next 6 months on everything that is somewhat delusional and somewhat crazy, and see what I can do. So that was From the Ground Up. And that's on its 4th year. And it's been exciting to see like people come in and just dedicate themselves to something that they don't know if it's possible, but they just want to see what they can get out of themselves. And in turn, learn cycling lingo that makes no sense at all.
Right.
And that kind of like was this whole side of the sport that I didn't think I needed to impact. That I didn't think it was my job, but I wanted to impact, right? It's a group of people that I want to be a part of. I don't want to be the person. I can ride past someone with a dog on my back and smile, but if I'm riding past it 3 times their speed and they got on a bike last week, it's still going to be demoralizing. And so
totally,
I wanted to find a way
scary.
to try to, So I wanted to find a way to try to combat that or battle that, even if it's not in the moment every time. Over the course of a season for me, I want to be the human. I don't want to just be the cyclist. And I wanted to humanize the sport. I want to humanize myself. And so I think it's selfish at times, but it's my way of, it's that distraction for myself that's so valuable, right? It's that focus on helping other people in life, in sport, and then being able to still take on my own thing, and neither one takes away from the other. It's just a priority to given time.
Yeah. I love that. And I agree. They're mutually supportive and not taking away from each other. That's a really good way of putting it. What was your path to kind of pitching this to sponsors? So was that something like this was born out of the pandemic? What has enabled it to continue to be successful past that point? Because as you said, the pandemic was, okay, there's no events. Now what do we do? And okay, we have athletes who can tell stories that are engaging. Well, now we're back to, we have events on the calendar. I'm always curious, not only about athletes' careers, but even projects like this. What makes it sustainable?
I think what makes the project sustainable is that it right now, in our sport. It provides a level of content creation that's kind of unparalleled. I mean, it's to add another thing to my resume that wasn't even planned. I'm kind of a director now, and I don't know what that means. I still don't know what that means.
Yeah.
But learning how editors work, how filmers work, how to set up shot lists and be involved in what's valuable in an interview, what doesn't need to be shot, first off, has been valuable for me as an athlete, because then I'm trying to do my own stuff and I'm like, okay, we don't need that. We do need this. But I think that's what's propelled this project is first, it's been growing if you look at it like a business, it's been positively growing each year, either viewership wise or the people involved, the community. So that's valuable to sponsors, right? Because in our sport, well, most sports, brand loyalty is incredibly important. So if you're coming into the sport with no knowledge and you're able to be educated by somebody, I don't think you're being sold. I think it's a value to everybody.
Yeah.
Secondly, there's that level of just inspiration that people get on a trainer from the ground up is now something that, like, I will go back and watch. And it's an inspirational story. It's this weird juxtaposition of like education and reality TV, but it's also exciting, right? And I mean reality TV in a sense of like, you're setting people up to do something and you're saying, hey, go fail a bunch of times on camera. We're all going to watch you.
Yeah.
And so it's trying to figure out of like, what is the goal of this consistently each year? And that's somewhat difficult as it changes, right? Because everything changes. As the pandemic ended, we had to realize that our value wasn't just having bikes. The first year, that was crazy. To be able to say, hey, we have 3 bikes. That was a big deal. Now people can get bikes now every time they want. So now it's like, okay, what are we offering to people? And it's become that community aspect, right? It's become that you can come to a race and you'll know other people there because of this project. And that's awesome in a place that can be really daunting and lonely. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think that's the value. I'm constantly trying to figure that out. I think the most interesting part from the ground up started being the same as all of my sponsors, but it's now its own separate entity. There's one sponsor that's the same, the helmet and glasses sponsor, Sweet Protection. Other than that, I've found a place to just, first off, my personal sponsors understand that this project is not focused on professional racing. It's not performance-based. It's based on human interests and how you move forward in life. And that doesn't have to be the focus of the people supporting me. And then on the other side, the people supporting the project can understand that I'm a professional athlete. I'm going to ride who I'm paid to ride. It doesn't take away from the content being created because it's not about me. It's about everyone else involved, right? If you happen to see me riding past on my Factor mountain bike with NV wheels, it doesn't take away from the project being sponsored by a local bike shop and i9 wheels, right? And if everyone can understand that and there's communication, it works really well. And so that was something that like took a lot of learning and talking, but as like I've been really proud of because, you know, if I had made NV sponsor it for the sake of sponsoring it, that's not their demographic. I don't want to be selling $2,500 wheels to new beginner riders. They shouldn't be buying them. And so but you have to be able to be confident enough in yourself to be having that conversation. And so it's not easy. And that's the thing. You learn from everything. You just dive head first in and figure it out.
When you were talking earlier about that direct relationship that you have with your sponsors versus like in contrast to having an agent who's a go-between, and there's definitely a place for agents, no knocking agents here, but I never had an agent either. And I just remember I got to a point later in my career where I got so frustrated even just with team management. So sign with a team, you automatically have a suite of sponsors that are already associated with that team. I had nothing to do with pitching them. You know, team management brings them in. You try to build relationships with those sponsors during the year, but it's really difficult because you never have that direct line of communication. And then if you manage to, chances are you're going to have a totally new suite of sponsors the next year. And it was so frustrating as an athlete to see the lack of just see this opportunity go to waste. It just was such a wasted opportunity year over year. And then also there were times when I would watch team management just destroy these relationships in ways that felt so preventable and unnecessary. And it was super frustrating. So, you know, I didn't go to gravel or anything like that, but I did start to reach out and try to build out a personal suite of sponsors that helped me buffer that year-to-year contract negotiation with trade teams. And two things that really kind of bubbled up for me as you were describing it were accountability and agency. So it's not just about having that direct line of communication when things are going well and being able to pitch when you feel really good about things. But like you said, it's being able to be accountable when things go wrong or there's friction and having the agency to address it directly yourself. Because like you said, you're a person and your integrity is very much on the line in everything that you do. And I love how you're bringing that into relationships. And so much of what you're describing, I think, is relatable to any relationship. That accountability, that agency, that trust. It's not just business, and you're bringing that into your relationships with these athletes that you're bringing up through the sport. And that's, as you said, it's about making good humans too.
Yeah, and I think exactly what you said. I have some thoughts on agents, but the reality is if you're looking for an agent because you don't want to learn, you want to focus on racing your bike, you don't need to have the conversations about money, I believe you should still have an agent who doesn't block you from those conversations, right? Wants you on every call, gives you the option. It's your choice. What I struggle with is when agents want to be in full control and, hey, I'm going to figure this out. Don't worry. The problem is they have their own agenda always. It's a business for them. Right. And I think that as an athlete, you should always want to know what's going on with your career. And I think if it's not that someone's doing something inherently bad, but if an agent has two athletes and they're going to make more money on that with a different company, you're going to end up with that company. That's just good business for them. And it's not that they're not looking at it and being like, oh, say it's Trek and Specialized. They're not looking at it and saying Specialized is better than Trek or Trek is better than Specialized for a certain human. They're just looking at it like, hey, this is better for the agent. Everyone's getting sponsored. Everyone's getting bikes. It's good. And it doesn't even have to be a financial thing. It has to be a thing with like, maybe the other company really needed you. They wanted to put all their marketing budget behind you and they were excited to work with you, but they never even got to have that conversation past the financial part because the agent stepped in and said, hey, I'll deal with this. And so I think it's just communication as it is with everything. It's not that agents are inherently bad. I've constantly felt like I wanted to be in that position sometimes. Like I love pitching and having that conversation.
Yeah.
But as you get further in this conversation, that's my issue with it. I think there's a very small amount of money that should actually be going to an agent. And it doesn't really make sense to me as an athlete. I look at it and I think of whatever that agent might be getting more than what I could do because they're willing to push harder. I probably am just going to pay it to them. And then was it worth it at all?
Right.
I just took more money from my sponsor who could invest in something else.
That's so true. And especially when, as you said, they position themselves almost as a gatekeeper, that creates a really dangerous power dynamic, especially for younger athletes. Yeah. And working with an agent, I'm guessing, would have had a really different outcome at that stage where you were debating between Envy's wheel set and 50% off and a $6,000 offer from someone else. Like that's the kind of decision when you're focusing on it for yourself and you know what you need for the long term, you then have that agency.
And I think people need to know that it's possible without an agent, right? You can write your own emails. You can write, you don't need it. Or if you get the good results, people will reach out. That's the reality. I had an agent for about a year. I signed Yumbo without an agent. After that, I felt like I should have someone to kind of work in the background while I was doing things. I don't know that I regret it, but it didn't work out how I planned, obviously. And I think the agent probably pushed Yumbo way more than I would have pushed them myself.
Yeah.
And so I had an agent from like during my contract of Yumbo, but they didn't help sign it. Sorry, they read through the contract, but they were not being paid at all. And then after that, we had a deal of like, for every X amount I make, they'd make a percentage, but they didn't make a percentage until I made over a certain number. And so, but when I went to privateer, it was funny because we kind of just didn't really talk about it. But then the minute I started doing well, they kind of started texting me again. And it's very interesting because if you get on a phone call with agents, you can have the same learning experience of what you and I are talking about. After I won Schwamigan last year, which is the first big win in the Grand Prix I had like 24 agents reach out. I would say like 6 of which
Wow.
were like proper, proper, have multiple athletes more than just people who want to support.
Mm-hmm.
I had a phone call with a couple. It's funny because if you just listen and then ask questions based on what they're saying they're going to do, you can very quickly realize if it's valuable to you or not, right?
Right.
You know what's best for yourself. You have a gut feeling. And I think agents can be valuable. I really want to remind people they can be, but they are not holding any value from you. You can ask for the same value that they can ask for. They don't have better contacts. They don't have better any of this. I think it's different in other sports, with tennis and golf, where you're trying to get into these certain tournaments. Cycling isn't like that. And so to me, it's very specific of like, are you a human who is stressed out by having conversations on Zoom and figuring things out? And does that failure take you down and then you can't train well? Or is it worth it to just, have those conversations, figure yourself out, and be able to then, I still take my conversations to other people I trust and say, hey, what do you think of this? Same as I would an agent, but I'm not paying them anything. They're my friends. And I kind of like the fact that I'm not paying them. It gives me a more real answer most of the time than I otherwise would get.
Right. And they know you as a person, and they're going to be putting you as a person ahead of any financial considerations as well. Yeah. All right. I've got just a couple questions left for you.
Cool.
What, given that you're helping these younger athletes or newer athletes get into the sport in different ways through your projects, and you have all of this experience, I think it's easy for people to forget that professionals also started with zero experience at some point. Maybe that was at a much earlier age or much longer ago, but you have this really wonderful perspective of having gone from zero to the literal top level of the sport. So you've kind of seen it all, and along the way, you've interacted with other people who are also experiencing different things and kind of seeing it all. What are some of the things that you see as contributing to sustainable careers, or are there specific mistakes that you see athletes making that compromise their ability to have a sustainable career?
I think we've talked about it a little bit, but probably the biggest mistake I think athletes make is following money.
Yeah.
I think that's life in general too, at least for me so far, is that of course I want to be able to buy a house. I want to be able to do all these things. I have goals. I have financial goals, but the reality is most of the time that I've made decisions based on money, I've been like, that just didn't work out how I thought it was going to work out. There's an experience I had very young. I went to a bike show with my dad, and I had like $280 cash. I had like saved up. I think I was like 14, 15 years old at the time. And Specialized had their new TT helmet out at the time. And I was like, I could buy this, or I could buy a carbon water bottle cage and still have money left. Sorry. So, and so I ended up the whole day, 4, 5, 6 hours going back and forth between these things. I don't know what to buy. I don't know what to do. My dad was like, just make a damn decision. Who cares? I ended up going with the water bottle cage. It was like $80. I still had $200 left. And 3 rides in, I was popping bottles out.
Oh, no.
And it was a reminder that it doesn't matter if you have money left if what you bought doesn't provide value. And so I think that's, for me, has been a big learning experience of like, first off, I think I'm a little bit like, I haven't owned a car since I moved back to Europe. There's a lot of little things that like I've been frugal, but also like in the moment of things, I'm the first person to spend money because I want to spend money on like memories and people and things. Like I love great dinners. I love the experiences. And then juxtapose that with like, how do you deserve to make money? I think it's a constant conversation of like in a sport that's very unquantifiable, like we've talked about, where the numbers don't always constitute the direction of how you're moving. It's constantly, the mistake people make is thinking that going and having 27 conversations and earning an extra grand was worth the stress of just tying yourself to a company, understanding why they can't pay you more, and trying to institute something into that contract as to, okay, just so you know, I think I'm worth a little more. Can we add a clause in that I make 20% of the bonuses I make this year into salary next year? Or trying to figure out a structure that you can earn the money you want to, that's valuable to the company. And so I think it's hard. It's easy to say that don't follow the money. But I think the point of that is that finances are just a stigma people don't want to talk about consistently. And so if you find a way to just make them if you find a way to make them something that you just deal with in your daily life isn't the reason you make decisions, you're going to be a lot happier.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds like it's not just, not following the money, but also in the short term specifically, like keeping an eye toward that longer term.
Yeah.
Sustainability. Yeah. All right. Last question for you. And I know this is a hard one for everybody. So I understand that this is like a tip of the iceberg, but is there anybody that you'd like to give a shout out for having been a good wheel for you? I'm sure it's a lot of different people, but I always like to ask and give the opportunity.
Yeah, there's a lot. I think a lot of the people that I think of quickly, like Q&M has been a sponsor. It's a Michigan advertising agency that they supported me in the beginning when I wasn't worth what they were paying me. Right. And they haven't really paid much more than that at the beginning, but they've wanted to be involved continuously ever since. And with them, I've learned a lot about what it is to have relationships.
That's awesome.
And then there's a lot of people like Gwinnett Carhart, Jay Ellis and his brother Dan Ellis. They're in Michigan. They're people who I run my ideas by, right? If I'm feeling judgmental or I'm feeling like I'm worth something more, or I just want to vent, they're people I can go vent about business with, and they'll listen and then give constructive feedback, that's not just agreeing with me.
Oh, that's great.
That I think is you have to have those people, because if I had a conversation recently with somebody who was like, I want to do this. And I was like, that's a rash decision. And they're like, oh, but my dad and my girlfriend agree. I was like, yeah, of course they agree. That's their job. They're supposed to do that. And so I think it's not anything against parents and significant others, but those people aren't the best to take really hard decisions to sometimes, because they want to support you. When you say you think you're worth more, they're going to tell you are.
Of course they will. Yeah.
And so, and this all, And so I think I'll end with that is obviously my parents and brothers and girlfriend have been instrumental in just believing in me. It's been funny when I started dating my girlfriend just post-COVID, I wasn't making very much money, right? And it takes a person to not stress out more or not stress me out more about that of hey, you got to find more. We got to buy a house soon. Or hey, we need to do this. Of just understanding as part of the dream, and that hopefully it fit into the timeline of okay, Alexey's going to go to school by this time, or he's going to figure it out. But have an understanding, because I think it's, it's hard for parents also to be like, hey, you're at the top of the sport and now you're making nothing, living in our house. What are you doing here? And so I think it's all those people that help you along the way. And I guess to bring this full circle, because like I said, I love cycles and they always exist.
Yes.
I have an ongoing list in that notebook I talked about of just I literally write people's names down who've ever done good for me. And it's a constant, it's so fun to go back to that, because it's simple, right? It's that feeling we all want that is not something, you're not asking anybody for anything specifically. You just want them to be there for you, that relationship. And even if you can, if you go away from it for 2 years, I feel like you can always come back and have this moment that brings everyone together, right? Like you and I riding Mount Lemon.
I know. I was just
you have this moment, and all of a sudden you're just
to now.
Yeah, it's crazy.
For sure.
It's insane though.
Awesome.
How often have we talked? We've maybe random
zero.
comments on social media. Yeah, but
I know.
It's crazy.
But here we are. We had this amazing conversation. Thank you so much for being here today, Alexey. It's been an absolute pleasure to dig into all of this with you. It's so fun. And just thank you for doing what you do for the world of cycling and all of these people and athletes coming up. I want to just mention that looking at the work with Phase 2 and from the ground up, so much of the feedback talking about the impact of those projects on people's lives is, as we would expect, but I think it's worth mentioning, goes so much further than the bike and so much further than sport. And so I know you're having a huge impact in the sport, but I also know that the impact of what you're doing is going so much further than that. So thank you for being a good wheel.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
The last time I got to speak with Alexey in person was many years ago on a random training day in Tucson, Arizona. We happened to be climbing the infamously long Mount Lemon and struck up a conversation that lasted all of the way up and down the mountain. I was struck then, as much as I am now, by how reflective Alexey is about everything he does. I really appreciate how his take on fun and compartmentalization contrasts with and adds dimension to previous conversations we've had on the show. I also love his approach to balance, how it embraces how messy life can be even when you do manage to balance all the important things. He has a full plate and accepts that he might be spilling sides and condiments from time to time, so long as the key staples are there. life is messy. Balance is messy. I often find myself feeling like I should be able to do all of the things, and specifically in a tidy, orderly way. It's no wonder. When we're constantly being sold products that promise to optimize our productivity, relationships, and efficiency, it's easy to start believing that our messy lives are a problem that we can and should solve with the right software or subscription or supplement. But it's not realistic. And despite the ads served up by the algorithm, I don't have to feel ashamed about or fight the mess. I also don't have to carry all of the things on my plate right now. I can set some down, even spill some, and still come back to them later. And maybe all you really need to manage it all is a yellow notepad. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. This is an abridged version of the full interview. To get full-length and extended versions of each episode, sign up for a membership on Ko-Fi. Memberships start as low as $3 a month. Check out all the perks at ko-fi.com/beagoodwheel. That's ko-fi.com/beagoodwheel to sign up. The Be a Good Wheel podcast is produced by our wizard behind the curtain, Maxine Philivong. If you loved today's episode, don't forget to rate us 5 stars. Until next time, thanks for listening and thanks for being a good wheel.